all of us are believing engines in that sense. This is one thing that critics of religion got right, but they don't see that it applies to themselves as well. They make these arguments. I have ascended beyond fallacy. They say nobody can think straight thoughts. How can you think a straight thought? I have ascended beyond. I am an academic. I have ascended beyond mere mortals, and I'm able to do these kind of things. We're all very good at finding evidence. I want to think there's 182 different genders or some nonsense like this, and you're able to find evidence. You are able to conjure arguments and evidence that will support that belief. That's obvious because that's exactly what many, many academics, doctors, experts, rulers are doing. But what we all are very bad at, and which I also stress, is finding and accepting evidence contrary to our desires and our beliefs. That is what we all have to get much better at.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Faith Deposited. My name is Wilbur, and today we're joined by William M. Briggs. Now, Professor Briggs is a statistician and philosopher known for his rigorous critiques of modern statistical practice and scientism, something I'm sure we'll get into a little more later today. He previously served as a professor of statistics at Cornell and earlier worked with the U.S. Air Force. Is that right? In electronic cryptology.
That's right.
Yes. He's the author of several influential books, including Everything You Believe is Wrong, a personal favorite of mine, and Uncertainty, the Soul of Modeling and Statistics, where he challenges conventional views on probability, scientific inference, and the limits of modern science. Professor Briggs, welcome to Faith Deposited.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, I guess first things first, what's there on the chalkboard? Is this something you have for a lecture coming up?
Yes. That's the importance of not making decisions.
The importance of not making decisions.
I have a lecture. It'll come up this week. I don't know when you're going to post this, but it'll be this coming week. You don't always, there's many propositions in life that you don't have to move to immediate belief on. So the one I use is there's this guy named Beckett or Thomas something or other, representative who claims, the headline was last week, there's 5 or 6 underwater UFO bases somewhere in the Atlantic, and he claims that these are there, and they're not only, they're I don't know what they're doing there or what plans they have or something like this, but he says they're there. Now, you could dismiss these kind of a thing, or you could just give it very low weight. You don't have to say it's impossible. You don't have to puncture somebody's, somebody's story or something like this. You don't have to move to belief either way. You don't have to believe it. You don't have to embrace it and give it complete certainty, and you don't have to reject it and give it complete certainty the other way. You could be very calm about it and say, I don't think it's true, but and the reason for this is you allow yourself then to be changed by evidence, new evidence that comes in, probative evidence that comes in. Of course, this is just a fanciful example, but it applies all over the place. There's only a few things that we know with necessary certainty. But a lot of the stuff we just don't know. We're uncertain about quite a lot. And you don't have to move to belief. You don't have to move to something, I say this is absolutely true. And because of the math is, once you believe something is absolutely true or absolutely false, moving you from that position becomes impossible mathematically unless you have some sort of spiritual conversion or something like this. And so a lot of stuff that we have in life should just remain at uncertainty. And all this stuff that's happening in the news now, who's really secretly ruling the world and all these kind of theories that are brooded about. People are coming to argue with each other and, what's your take on this? If you don't have the right take, why then we could no longer be friends and things like this. So I'm just trying to get people to understand you don't have to believe. You can remain at uncertainty. Allow yourself to be persuaded by new evidence, except for those things which are absolute necessary truths. There's quite a lot of those too. For instance, you exist. I know I exist. I know that I know. I will myself to do certain things. So all of these are absolute positive certainties, and in matters of religion and so forth. These we could know with absolute certainty, and so you can't be budged from those, and that's fair. But a lot of life, a lot of science, a lot of stuff that we just do, we don't have to be certain.
So this idea that we can have certainty about certain things, we could call those, self-evident truths, fundamental truths, axiomatic truths, whatever you like. Those truths, I mean, it seems like modern skepticism has really thrown those into the acid bath. There's this notion of just this radical skepticism. More famous internet atheists like Alex O'Connor have, posited this idea of
Oh,
like
no.
Mariological cosmic skeptic, I think he's also known by. He's I think his more famous debates have been with, Ben Shapiro, and he's even had discussions with William Lane Craig, a prominent evangelical Christian
Well, yeah.
apologist.
Well, Craig, everybody knows Craig, at least in my circle.
Yes, of course. And another William. So he's had this idea of, Mariological nihilism, that ultimately things don't exist. So, your claim that I exist, although
And he said that into his microphone, did he? It wanted to
multiple times.
persuade you that
Yes.
that he didn't exist and the things that he was using do not exist. That's self-refuting. All those things. There is no truth. I can confidently tell you it is absolutely true. There is no truth. All of these things are self-defeating, and they're just as risible as they sound. You could just dismiss them without a second thought. There's no reason to argue with people like this because it's clearly, they may think they're sincere, but of course they cannot be. It is an impossibility that they are sincere. One thing we know is there must be truths, because if you say there are no truths and you think that's true, well, then you've just proven a truth. Therefore, there's other truths. Like, for instance, every time you think you have proven something false, whatever that is, and you may have, the logical contrary of that is yet another truth. So there's truth abounds, and we could know it. That's
So
simple
it's
as that.
fundamentally inescapable, right? I mean, truth exists.
It is absolutely fundamentally inescapable.
And so how does this have implications for religion, for theology, for our understanding of truth? I mean, obviously, if we can accept that truth exists, it seems like that is the necessary precondition to properly do theology.
I think people do, though. I think everybody does. I think even these people who are out there, claiming that there's no truth, nothing exists, all that kind of stuff, they don't believe it. Of course they don't believe it. They never believe it in a practical sense. So you have to find out, and this is kind of my journey. I started out in science and thinking science was the answer to all things, just like everybody, in a certain way. I was never quite adamant about it, but I just thought it was true because everybody else that I was around thought it was true and it seemed plausible until you start thinking about it. Well, what makes something truth? Where does truth come from? Why are things true and why are things false? And in order to move in that direction, you need to have something that makes things to be true, makes things to be false. And so this could lead you very naturally. The truths that are written on your heart, that kind of stuff can lead you, even without any kind of, religious stories, if you like, because a lot of people are dismissive of these kinds of things without actually thinking too much about them. But if you start bringing these up, well, let me tell you the story of Jesus on the cross and so forth, and they're going to dismiss that and say, that's nothing. That's just so much talk and all that. So, and you're not going to reach anybody thinking, along those lines. And so St. Thomas, he wrote a book, Summa Contra. You're supposed to say gentiles, or I guess that's the Latin pronunciation, but it's against the Gentiles. A book that he wrote to interact with people who were skeptical, who didn't want to have the standard religious arguments that are very convincing to some, but not to everybody. He moved from, let's just think in first principles. Let's think of, what do we mean by truth? Well, that's the way things are, the representation theory of truth. And then how do things come about? How do things happen? What does it mean to have a cause and all these kind of things? Just from very first principles. And through these kind of things, you can reason yourself right into faith easily.
And so this also seems like it's been the tradition with a capital T, but also lowercase t, in philosophy and theology since time immemorial, and only recently has this idea that truth isn't something we can accept, and that God isn't something that we can reason to. It's only a very recent invention, isn't it?
That's right. That's exactly right. And the reason they think is, well, science is the answer to everything. Everything is just, actually, that's also an ancient sort of philosophy too, Democritus, right? Everything is just atoms in the void, things bumping into each other. with laws that come from who knows where. I mean, you're not supposed to ask that question. You're not supposed to ask where things actually came from. You're just supposed to accept that they are. But all things must have a reason for their existence. All things must have a sufficient explanation. And we sort of box ourselves in science with the idea of cause, where we only think about the efficient cause of something. One thing bumping into another is an efficient cause of something, but that's not the full explanation of what's going on with anything. You need the full explanation, the full cause in its ancient sense. And so we're essentially having the same debates the ancient Greeks did, 2,600 years ago plus, and having them now in science. But science can't explain itself. And that's the way I think that's kind of my goal, is to talk to scientists to prove to them that you cannot prove your presuppositions. You cannot prove your own premises. Those have to arise elsewhere. And so let's think about those and then what they mean and which premises you're missing out on, which are holding science back. So those are the types of things that interest me.
Yeah. I mean, the first thought that comes to mind is, I believe Ecclesiastes 1:9, there's nothing new under the sun. And, these ancient conversations, these ancient misunderstandings about the world, they crop up again and again, once per generation. I'm sure there are some representatives happy to stand under the oriflamme of these ideas. But scientism is sort of a newer concept, because science, as we understand it, in this kind of, well, I won't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like
certainly go ahead.
You intimated a little bit that, you had this realization that science can't explain everything. And I had a similar one, prompting in part, discovering your blog actually by happy chance. But there is this idea that science can, if only we hold out hope that, our reason, the illumination of our minds will cast light on every corner of the universe, and even someday perhaps explain the universe itself without God.
Of course, that's simple, because science uses mathematics, for instance, which of course is not scientific. Mathematics is not scientific. We accept, and science relies heavily on empiricism. I need to see it's proved. I need to propose a theory and I need to see that it works out. That's a very good thing for things that are empirical. Of course, that's exactly the way science should work. But for instance, mathematics, the language of science, this is not scientific. I mean, you reason that, I have a number, 1, and I have the number, if I let x equal 1 and I let y equal 1, all right, I'm going to start to do some algebra here. And if I say x equals y, and then I could say, well, you know what? Y could also equal x. Okay, that works for the number 1. That works for the number 2. Works for number 3. In fact, it works for all the numbers I can think of. But how many numbers are there? Well, there's an infinite number of numbers. So you can't check it for all infinite number of numbers. So now you're moving to a proof. All mathematics is like this. You start with axiomatic beliefs, which you cannot prove. You cannot prove. You can only know them by inductive methods, by intellection. But you do believe them. The people that actually come to think about them can come to believe them. Not everybody knows all axioms. But you come to believe them based on lack of proof, lack of empirical proof. And then you start proving other things because of the relation that you started by proving. That's how mathematics builds, so these axioms and so forth. And so how can you even do that? You can't do that scientifically. There's a whole host of things. Mathematics is now, this immense great field, none of it which is proved empirically. And it's all just believed based on simpler reasoning from first principles, which cannot be proved, the axioms, which cannot be proved, but which are believed. And you just build on that. And not only that, there's the other thing that most people miss. Yes, you can start with these axioms like Pino's axioms and arithmetic and so forth, and then build up 1 + 1 = 2. Aha, now I can prove this, right? And then you can go on to prove more and more difficult things. But what you also haven't proved, which you're also taking on faith, which you take axioms on faith, is the ability to reason. The ability to apply these logical steps, that you're moving all of these symbols around and so forth. This is something else which you also must accept as true. So that's how they tried to build in skepticism of all these kind of things. That's what Hume's approach and others were, these radical skeptical ideas. Well, since I have to do that and I can't prove them empirically, therefore they must be false. But you have just argued in that particular argument, supposing you like to believe these kind of Humean skepticism or skeptical arguments and so forth, you have just proved something that cannot be proved empirically. So you are believing something that you say you cannot believe. So you can't even think. It's yet one more self-refutation. These things are all logically inconsistent. That, I think, is starting to be recognized a little bit. I mean, all things are not new under the sun, and we're saturated in scientism now for all kind of reasons. But I think maybe we're moving a little bit past those things, the skepticism we had, which is a fanciful, academic topic. Academics could take this stuff up and they can write lots of papers, which they don't believe themselves, and get themselves a reputation and so forth. But I think we're moving past that. At least that's my take on it. I don't know if it's quite true, but it seems to be.
Yeah. And I mean, it seems like it maybe occurs at both ends of the spectrum, as you have the sort of, in the academy, you have people realizing that certain things bump up against reality. Although it seems like there's probably more tolerance in the academy for fanciful ideas, like that old joke of the professor of economics who says, yeah, it works in practice, but does it work in theory?
Exactly.
And then at the grassroots level, it seems like people immediately can intuit certain truths, like, maybe realities about gender, or, perhaps about mathematical truths. And I mean, just, if it's true, then we accept it. If it's not true, then we don't accept it. And why do you suppose?
A lot of academia right now, they move from desire. They don't start with reality. They start with desire. I want this to be true. What will make it true? All right. I want there to be infinite genders. So because I want that, what can I do to make that proposition true? Now, here's what we're all very good at. I stress this all the time. All of us are believing engines in that sense. This is one thing that critics of religion got right, but they don't see that it applies to themselves as well. They make these arguments. I call it the I have ascended beyond fallacy. They say nobody can think straight thoughts. And again, how can you think a straight thought? I have ascended beyond. I am an academic. I have ascended beyond mere mortals, and I'm able to do these kind of things. But we're all very good at finding evidence. So I want to think there's 182 different genders or some nonsense like this. And you're able to find evidence. You are able to conjure arguments and evidence that will support that belief. All right, that's obvious, because that's exactly what many, many academics, doctors, experts, rulers are doing. But what we all are very bad at, and which I also stress, is finding and accepting evidence contrary to our desires and our beliefs. That is what we all have to get much better at. You always hear scientists are always boasting of this ability. And of course, they are also, a lot of them are just lying. A lot of them are fooling themselves. The scientists are no better at this than anybody else. The joke that you tried to make is a true thing, because the theory is so real and so beautiful to me. I have proved this theory. It has to be true. Everything else has to be wrong. So let me move to legislate to put my economic theory into practice. And everything that doesn't fit this is like Procrustean economics. I'm going to chop off at the end, or I'm going to stretch to make fit this theory. That's the way academics are nowadays. That's the way it is in all of science and so forth. That's the way it is with this gender ideology. They cannot see evidence that does not fit their theory, and they refuse to acknowledge this evidence. And they move to belief, and there's nothing you could do to budge them. Arguments don't win people over. This is another thing we should have. You and I can talk about these things. We can have these arguments and so forth. And that's what the book, Everything You Believe. Don't buy this book, everybody. Don't buy Everything You Can Believe Is Wrong. I'm working on a second edition. I'm about halfway through, and you can buy that. But
I would strongly encourage you to buy the second one then, because the first one has been
arguments are only convincing to a very small set of us who are able to use this facility. That's not most people. It'll never be most people. That's just the way we're built. Most people can't do these kind of things and wouldn't have the inclination, even if they had the ability. It's just something that only occurs to a certain small segment of lunatics like ourselves who can do that kind of a thing. So you're not going to win by those type of appeals. Unfortunately, but that's just we're supposed to be rational creatures, right? That's our That's what separates us from the beasts, is our rationality and so forth. But we don't often employ it. We often want to embrace being beasts because that's a lot easier.
Yeah, I think you're certainly right to say that, because we're incarnate beings, logos can only take us so far, and for so many people, some people are more persuaded by, emotional narratives, or they're persuaded by, personal subjective experiences, and obviously there's room for that, and we're all susceptible to it to some degree. But this appeal to reason itself, I think, can also be pushed too far, and that's maybe what scientism to some extent has done, is it's taken reason and it's sort of abstracted it. It's enshrined it and put it on a pedestal, making it the hypothetical thing that we should reach for as an absolute truth. But it can't exist in a void, right? Because ultimately, especially you and I as Christians, we think that truth is synonymous with love, which is synonymous with goodness. Like, these things cannot be separated. So if you pursue truth without really reasoning about how the world works as a whole, it seems like you can actually corrupt your pursuit. Not that you can ever corrupt truth, but you can corrupt your pursuit. And what do you think is it in modern science, or I should say, probably in the academy more broadly, that, I mean, because there's some kind of inner propulsion moving towards these more fanciful ideas, silly ideas, some of them just, prima facie false ideas, but still, I mean, they get funding, and they get applause, and of course they get published. So what is it that you think is driving
The
these moves?
academy, there's all number of things. I feel resentment, hatred of being alive, hatred of the truth, hate for what they are, wanting to take everybody else down a little bit to bring them to their level, all of these kind of things. There's also bandwagon effects. There's any number of things that happen bad in the academy. The need for racial and sexual orientation quotas and sex quotas, all these kind of things staffed academia with a lot of people who should never have been there in the first place and shouldn't be there now. And because we respected academia, because academia did do a lot of great things a long time ago, we gave them a lot of respect, and all these new people got respect for their crazy new ideas. And it's just now self-perpetuating, and they're now in control of the entire education system. So kids come up learning these incorrect, false, wrong, misleading ideas and so forth. And the whole thing just gets worse and worse and worse. There's nothing. In order to fix it, I mean, it sounds absurd. I say cut off all funding for science. Cut it off. No, we don't, no government funding for science. I don't mean to cut off all funding for science. If there's somebody out there who wants to pay, let them pay. But it doesn't mean the government should pay for all this stuff. Government should get out of the education business. It's so corrupt at this point that it's just feeding the beast, and it has to be axed off. There's no other way. You got to chop off this gangrenous limb, because there's no salvaging it at this point. But that sounds awfully harsh to a lot of people, and they can't see it. But otherwise, these things are just not going to go away on their own. They're not going to be won over by arguments, that's for sure. You're not going to go into a women's study department and you're going to say to them, look, there are men and there are women, and they're unequal. Men will never be women. Women will never be men. The two cannot do the same things that, for the most part, that the other can do. Their capabilities are different. Their manners of reasoning and looking at the world are different. Both of these are good and complementary, except when they're put to cross purposes. Therefore, we ought to dismantle this department because it is doing only harm. Now, do you think that's going to play? That's going to persuade them? Even if there's people in the department who believe that kind of a thing and they believe the truth, they're not going to go along with this. It's just it's personally painful. It costs. It's going to cost them livelihoods and so forth. So, not going to happen.
Now, one idea that I could have said earlier when referring to this kind of misconstrued understanding of truth, and how to go about pursuing it, is, I think you've put it well by describing it as idolatry. And so it seems like
Idolatry,
when that is the North Star, this this question of going against the status quo, of disagreeing with your compatriots on certain questions, not only becomes dangerous, it becomes like a fundamental attack, really, on someone's character or identity,
Yep.
or so forth.
Well, the idolatry is not mine, by the way. It was from my years ago. I ran a contest. I wanted to come up with a new name for scientism that was more evocative than scientism. And a reader whose name he had some nickname, like people do on the internet, and I can't recall the name of that nickname off the top of my head. But he came up with idolatry. I think it's perfect. The problem with it is scientists inject their morality into scientific arguments, not realizing they're injecting their morality into scientific arguments, and then claiming the results of those arguments tell us the correct moral thing to do. They don't recognize their own moral principles and so forth. Science is utterly silent on morality and ethics. It does not tell you what is right and wrong. You just can't tell from the atomic weight of radium whether abortion is wrong or something. You just can't get from here to there. So science could tell you, if you decide that abortion is wrong, what you might be able to do about this medically, but it can't tell you the right or wrong in the first place. And so this particularly applies to scientists, and even more so to a whole branch of these people who call themselves rationalists. They've adopted all sorts of premises, some which are true moral premises, some which are not. And they think, oh, I'm using my great powers of reason to argue from these things. And that's exactly what I have on the board here. They are reasoning along here, but they've started with false premises. And they don't recognize that. They think that these are somehow scientific and so forth. That's the problem of evil, which science has not solved. The problem of evil is that you often hear it stated in a negative way, but the real problem of evil is, as Dostoevsky and others have taught us, without God, all things are permissible. There is no evil without God. There is no evil, which is the absence of good, without there being the good. There's nothing without God. There's no evil whatsoever. You might say, well, I think it's wrong to cause somebody pain. That's just your opinion, man. I mean, what's the difference if I cause this guy pain or not? If I get away with it, nobody bothers me about it, and I enjoy it, why not? And there's a lot of twisted people out there who do enjoy giving people pain. And they were produced by evolution just like everybody else, so you can't say it's because we're all this way naturally. Murder is natural, too. Murder has been with us since day one, almost. And so that's a natural thing, too. You can't say that's wrong because you can't say, well, it's better for the species if we all try to propagate in this particular fashion. Well, the good of the species is a moral claim. That's not a scientific claim. You could say, if I accept the moral claim that the propagation of man into the future is a good, then you might be able to shed some light on that. But that is a moral premise that science has nothing to do with. And none of that stuff matters. Science can't answer any of those questions at all. Zero.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's absolutely no evil in the world. There's no good in the world. There's nothing. We can't even say that the universe is indifferent to us, because being indifferent implies an entity there that can be preferentially in your favor. There's nothing. It really is just atoms in the void. And that's what some of these people want to say. And they at least argue logically consistently if they say there's absolutely nothing to our feelings, nothing there, all this kind of stuff. They only err when they say, well, then how do we explain these things? How do we explain that we feel and that we feel pain, we feel pleasure? They say, well, that's a hallucination. And then you just think to yourself, okay, what is having the hallucination? You can't have something that's nothing having a hallucination. You have to have something there that is actually there, actually experiencing it. Even if your senses have all gone wrong and you're not seeing the world properly, you're still having these feelings. Even if something has gone wrong, there's still a you there. So science tries to answer these questions in the skeptical sense and fails miserably, absolutely miserably. And doesn't know it. And they don't know this because scientists, I've often told people, I got a PhD, big deal. Anybody can get a PhD, from a fancy university, all this kind of stuff. You can go through this whole thing, which I did. I got a mathematics PhD. And you never have to take a course in philosophy or humanities or any of this kind of stuff. You could just concentrate on your math. And so you come to believe your own biases that you bring to this, and bias is a neutral word, but you come to believe whatever you brought into this kind of stuff must be the right answer. And you never had any training or had anybody forcing you to think about these matters. And that's a great number of the great predominance of scientists. They don't know they should be thinking about these things, and hence we have idolatry, thinking that science can provide all these answers, and they're only bringing stuff in from the outside. They just don't see it.
I mean, to obviously, there's a lot that I'm partial about what you're saying, but to push gently against this, I mean, you have the likes of Steven Pinker or Sam Harris saying, well, actually, or maybe some of the new atheists, like Dennett or Dawkins, who would agree with some of the things that you say, your conclusions rather. They would say, yeah, of course, at the bottom of the universe is blind, pitiless indifference. Yeah, of course, we'll all turn to ash, and when there's a heat death of the universe, if that's what happens, and c'est la vie. But they'd say, still, in the brief twinkle of an eye that we're here, science has given us so much,
Nope.
and has taught us so much, and
Nope.
with a capital S,
Nope.
right?
No, they don't see it. You've just said we can all agree with the premise. Well, let's all agree with the premise. Everything is, there's not pitiless indifference. There's nothing to pity. There's nothing indifferent. It is just atoms in the void, and that's it. Now, it does not matter if science has given you something. That's nothing either. It doesn't matter that there are massacres and there are genocides and there is disease. That doesn't matter either. None of that matters. You can't. They're sticking in their preferences, their moral preferences on top of that, and saying, "Here, science is at least giving us this." No, it doesn't count. None of these people argue consistently. If you're going to hold with that materialist or eliminative materialist view that as it's so called, then you're left at absolute narcissism. You're left at absolute chaos. Nothing follows from that. That's the whole point. Nothing follows from that. Anything else is just your opinion on top of things. So science is not good. Science is not bad. Science is nothing if this stuff is true. Everything is nothing if this view is true, which of course nobody believes. So that's one reason to think that maybe this eliminative materialism is itself false.
So, I mean, as we mentioned before, materialism isn't a particularly new idea. I mean, there's new masks for it. But I mean, to defend Democritus a little bit, and maybe Bertrand Russell also, they would say, well, yeah, I mean, but these atoms in the void are all there is. They're at bottom, there is this brute fact, and this fact is that maybe all of reality is based on the elements. It's like water, fire, earth and air, or something like that. How would you respond to this idea that really all there is at bottom is just that brute fact?
If you accept that, then what follows from it is exactly what we've been talking about. Don't try to tell me your moral preferences on top of that, because those are meaningless. I could do whatever I want. Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. That's what follows from that. That's all that follows from that. Nothing, they immediately then segment into the good, the bad, all this kind of stuff. Always, absolutely always. And it doesn't follow from what they said they believed. Nothing follows from that. Absolutely nothing, except do whatever you want. And not even that doesn't follow, because there's nothing there to care. All right? It's an incredibly difficult thing to get people to understand, that they're bringing their own preferences, their own biases to these kinds. And I do say bias it's often given as a negative word, but it's just the state that you're in when you come to a new argument. That's your bias.
Whatever coincidental
it could be good.
predisposition
you
might
hold
have.
True ideas, you could hold false ideas, you could hold uncertain ideas. But that's what they're doing. But they don't see it. They don't see it. We got to bring them to see this. That's the hardest step.
So was how much of this was going through your mind in your own reversion to Catholicism? I mean, this is something that.
Well, I was born and raised Catholic, Catholic school and all this kind of thing. And I just got away from it after the military, and no particularly strong reason. I just thought I'd become a great scientist, all this kind of a thing. And I was around people who were academics, and, you tend to emulate the people who are around you at least some way and whatnot. And so it wasn't strong one way or another about the whole thing. But then I started trying to understand what makes good science. And why do I think this is good science? What do I mean by this is good science? And what do I mean by that I've explained something? So that's kind of my whole thing. There's two fundamental branches of philosophy, if you like. There's the things that are and why they are the way they are, and how we can know about the things that are and how they are. So there's this idea of ontology and epistemology, and I've kind of gone off into the epistemological side of things. How can we know these things? And that led me back for very simple arguments. I'm trying to understand causality, for instance. How do you explain the full cause of something? And just by doing that, to understanding that things have to have a reason for their being, kind of reawakened that small ember that was in there. And then I came to a full realization of all this stuff, a large
Intellective
number of years ago
appetite,
now.
you could say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Were there any books in particular, or?
Oh, yeah. So I recommend. There's all kind of books out there, but I recommend for people who are in the sciences and so forth, Ed Feser's The Last Superstition.
Delightful
The Last
book.
Superstition. This is an excellent book. It's so you want to understand about the way things are, and that's kind of what this book does. There's a little epistemology in there too, but I was utterly convinced by some of the arguments, thinking about, because I was trying to think, what is the scientific model? What does that mean? What are we saying when we make scientific statements and so forth? And what does it mean to be good science and so forth? And how do I get cause out of this? The full explanation for things. And the simplest argument of all, originating with Aristotle, of course, is the mover argument. You just take anything. I'm picking this pipe up, okay, right now. Okay, so what's the cause of this pipe rising in the air? Well, that's me picking it up. That's part of the thing. Okay, but as I'm doing this, the muscles on my arm are contracting, right? Certain muscles are in my biceps or whatever, shoulder, they're contracting. And what does it mean for the muscles to contract? Okay, well, the muscles are contracting. That means there are certain chemicals, reactions that are happening inside the muscle, and these things are happening now. Okay, so how do these chemical reactions take place? Well, the chemical reactions take place because of underneath these these molecules and everything doing certain things. Well, they're made of atoms, and the atoms are, neutrons, protons, electrons, and so forth. So these things are moving in a concerted way in order to, for my will to make this thing happen. And then what's underneath these atoms and everything? Well, there's inside the protons and neutrons, there's quarks, right? And they're all at the same time. This is all happening now at once. All at once. All of these things are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. The level of causation is going down and down and down. And some scientists say, I'm not with them, but they say underneath the quarks are these ideas of strings. Okay, these strings are these, one or no dimensional kind of things that live in high dimensions and they wiggle around and all that kind of stuff. Okay, fine. And so what's underneath the strings? You have to have a base. You have to have a base. You have to have a first cause. And any of these things, there has to be a series of these causes. It cannot go on for infinity or nothing could ever start. And this is just the ancient argument for the existence of God, because all movement, all primary first movement must begin with an absolute utter foundation that has certain characteristics that's unitary, non-divisible, simple, all this kind of a thing that produces these causes, primary causation. And so, I finally understood causation after reading all this. I read Ed and others, and I came to that realization. That's it. That's exactly what it is. That explains all things, all the causes of all fundamental things, or at least most things. It doesn't explain, for instance, it doesn't explain why 1 + 1 = 2. I mean, that has a reason, though. The axioms have a reason for being true, too. So these truths have to flow from something. There has to be a reason for these things to be true. And then that leads you down to this argument that it has to be a single reason at base. And so all of those, if you're a good scientist, you'll think through these things and you always start in your own field, of course, and then you reason backwards into these things, and you see then it applies everywhere.
And this we call God, right?
And this we call God. That's how Aquinas ends up all those arguments, of course.
That's fascinating. So it was really your pursuit in your field of science, which is statistics, and your.
Well, I did start. So I started with atmospheric physics. So I got a meteorology degree, my bachelor's degree in math, and then did atmospheric physics because back then I was convinced. I got out of the Air Force. And everybody was talking about global warming, as they called it back then. And I thought it might have been a real thing. It had plausibility and so forth. And I was interested I learned how the models are made. I learned all the thermodynamics and the math, all that kind of stuff. And it's a lot of fun. I think
That
it's
is
a lot of,
another place where I guess to some extent I could say, tread lightly because you tread on my dreams. But maybe instead of the word dreams, we would say the algorithm. You know, but the question of climate change, of global warming, or the big freeze. It seems like your earlier point was on some things we can actually just hold judgment. We don't have enough data to know what the answer is.
not
Is this
everybody. That's right.
gotcha? Is this question, the question of climate change or global warming or
Well,
whatever moniker we
mine
use?
was how do we know if these models are any good? Right.
Mhm.
And so, how do you know if a model's good? That leads you right into the idea of probability. And probability is the language of uncertainty and decision. And so, that is how I came to that. And then I realized it applied everywhere. It applies to all of science, not just models of any kind of physical model, any kind of medical model, or any sociological model, any model where you're trying to make sense of the way the world works and how do you judge those models. And I came to the view early on that climate change models, which nobody called climate change until just a few years ago, that we still called it global warming, changing from global cooling of the 1970s. They're not very good. They're not very good. And
What
that
do you think is
I
deficient
realized
in
that,
these
well,
models?
I'm sorry?
Yes, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you
No,
off
no, no,
there.
please. You got to
What do you?
interrupt me or I'll just never stop talking.
Fair enough. What do you think is deficient?
Well, there's any number of deficiencies, technical deficiencies, like their cloud parameterization schemes and things like this, and the idea that we don't have enough measurements all around the world and of the ocean, and the sort of fundamental limitations and so forth. But the real limitation is the scientists' own premises. I mean, so just not to bore people with the mathematics of this stuff or the physics of this stuff, but it's true. You release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at the lower levels will react by warming. But it's a logarithmic effect. That is to say, as the more carbon dioxide you put into the atmosphere, you get less and less and less and less. Finally, it's a trivial effect. You get out as much as you like, and you're only going to get a tiny little bit of change in heat. So that would be it. So yes, absolutely, mankind, everything causes climate change. Trees cause climate change. Cats cause climate change. Snails cause climate change. Everything that interacts with the atmosphere causes climate change. Okay, so we could agree that man does. But man's effect is pretty small. In order to then magnify that into being the control knob of the entire climate, you have to go in and add what are called feedbacks. You have to add in all kind of these feedbacks, which become themselves increasingly complex, that say as carbon dioxide goes up, it changes this, it changes that, and changes this. And all together, these things change the temperature in a much more dramatic way than carbon dioxide by itself. And the way they convince themselves of this, they're not stupid people, you understand, is they go back and they fit these models to past data, all right, which is not real data. A lot of the times they have to statistically massage all this kind of stuff because we historically didn't have data everywhere. So they manipulate that. They forget the uncertainty in that. They just forget the uncertainty they had in that. And they fit these models to the past data. And it fits these past data very well. All right, they're accurate in their statements. They say these models fit the atmosphere very well. Now, what they don't realize, and which it took me a long time to realize, is how many different models can fit the past data arbitrarily well. And the answer is infinite. The answer is actually infinite. You can have an infinity of models that fit the past data arbitrarily well to whatever measure of goodness that you select of any kind. And so how do we know this particular model that you fit so well to this past data is making good predictions of the future, and therefore that gives some weight to its theory? Well, that's where it falls apart. They don't make skillful predictions. And they're constantly adjusting these models, tuning them, that's what it's called. And they don't realize that they're doing this. They're making sort of self-fulfilling prophecies of these things, which is why so many of them have failed. I mean, how many times have we heard, no more snow, no more snow, no more Arctic ice, no more, all of these things fail. And you can just collect them, and I do. So I have a whole collection of studies that show wherever you happen to live, you live in California. California, I tell you now, you go to the scholar.google.com or Google, whatever you like, Look for California warming twice as fast. Words like this. Search for California warming twice as fast. You will find studies that show California is warming twice as fast as, say, the rest of the country or Oregon or something else. But you could do this for anywhere. And I did this. You could search for India. India is warming faster than everywhere else in the world. You could do it for Japan. Japan is warming twice as fast as anywhere else in the world. Everywhere turns out to be warming twice as fast as anywhere else in the world. Scientists do not see their own confirmation bias. I always say, this is one of my taglines, every scientist knows that confirmation bias exists, but none of them ever think it applies to himself. And that's all this is largely.
Just the ascendancy fallacy again.
I can go on and on about it all day, but that'll just bore people. I don't want to, discuss that, but we could if you wanted to.
I mean, it sounds like that's one of the places where science, in your mind is broken, where there is perhaps this secretive importation of certain philosophies, and it gets
this is
mixed
it.
in.
So they say the science is settled. Okay, you hear that stuff. You heard it during the COVID panic. You hear it for global warming, now called climate change. They say the science is settled, or for whatever particular area you're in. The science is settled. And what they want you to do is they want you to say, and therefore, their solution is therefore correct. That's what they want you to infer from this. But it doesn't follow. We've already agreed science does not tell you the right thing to do. So even if it's true, per impossible, that mankind is going to cause runaway global warming, nothing follows from that. Nothing follows from that other than that it's going to get hot out. Okay, now what do you want to do about it? That is an entirely different, separate question from whether the theory itself is true. So, but they miss that step, especially rulers. They'll miss it entirely, and they know they know they're lying about it, of course, because they just want the power that comes along with these kind of, and anything they could panic you into. And we enjoy our panics. We had global warming as a panic. It has cooled down. I think it has cooled down lately. And we had the COVID panic. We had years of COVID panic. And now we're having the artificial intelligence panic, mostly among elites at this particular time. We just love these panics. And we love to cede over control to anybody who will promise to us to remove the threat. And that we do far too often, way too often.
Yeah. Now, everywhere in Hollywood, you do see these great movies about supreme artificial intelligences that are just as smart as any human. In fact, they ascend way beyond that. They become all knowing beings.
Yep.
Maybe is that something that we can realistically?
No, never. It's never going to happen.
Why would you say that is?
See, they're easy proofs. First of all, a computer is just. You could build a computer. It's just states, right? The inside of a chip are just states. They're just 1 or 1 0 states, right? You could build a computer out of an abacus, right? It's perfectly simple. It's just an abacus. It's just 1 0 states. You can have the beads up or beads down. You can build an enormous contraption that somehow moves by, maybe you can hook water wheels up to it or something like this. The rules for moving those bits from on to off and off to on come from outside. All right, we impose those rules. There's no point at which this structure ever becomes alive and begins thinking. This is the problem of thinking that we're just machines, that we're just the sum of our parts. And that's another philosophy, that we're the sum of the parts philosophy, which is obviously false, which scientists should have known was obviously false for quite a long time. There's some papers. In fact, I have a story about this coming week too, about the artificial intelligence panic. The link to some famous papers by a guy named John Searle and so forth. So what is a computer? How do we know where the computer's boundaries are? How do we know that a computer is never going to think? How do we know a computer is not thinking like we are now? Well, it should be obvious that if it's just this state. Now, I give this example. So you have a computer is just a state of ones and zeros, right? So that you could have the chip. You could actually take a big piece of paper. It had to be pretty big. It doesn't matter. And you just write out the state. It's 1 0 0 0. So it has a mapping. You can just write them all out. Here's the state. Here's a big piece of paper. Now we have a clock tick, and it's in a new state given to it by rules that we dictate, the software. All right. Now it's in a new state. So we write down the new state in 1 0 1 0 0 to not fill up another big sheet of paper. And then another clock tick goes by, and we do it a third time and a fourth and so on. And in the end, we got this big sheaf of paper, right? Huge piece of sheaf of paper. We can go to the edge of this thing like you have, like you used to do as a kid. And I don't have a visual aid prepared, I'm sorry. But you can get these pieces of paper going, and you can flick them like this. And now those states are evolving. Now, is this thing alive? Is it thinking?
Well, the answer is obviously
it's not.
yes,
Of
right?
course it's not. The idea is absurd, but that's all a computer is. And so, well, Briggs, computers can now write their own software. No, they can't. You've told them, carry out these instructions. And these instructions happen to be software itself. At the very top, there's always someone telling the thing what to do. And they say, well, it's too complex. We don't even know what the output's going to be. Well, so what? You could take a bag of rice. That's my example here. You just take a 10-pound bag of rice, cut it open, strew it out onto the driveway or something like this. Now, the resulting pattern, could you have predicted that exact pattern? You could not have predicted that exact pattern. That does not mean the bag of rice is alive. Just complexity itself is not the definition of life. So all of these ways they try to use to convince you that these things are going to become somehow human themselves are false. And you can step through each of these arguments and so forth. It's just not the case. And these models are not nearly as good as people think they are. We've had computers hooked in. We're using computers now, right now. I mean, to chat with each other, and people are going to use a computer to view these things or listen to these things. And so we've had computers hooked to everything for quite some time. Computer scientists, I always say this too, they do a wonderful job naming their creations. They give them these names, neural nets. Oh my God, well, I'm having a brain in a can, a neural net, which the real name for these things, which doesn't sound nearly as sexy, is nonlinear regression models, neural net. Which is going to sell better, a neural net or a nonlinear regression model? And then genetic algorithms. Oh my God, I'm going to grow algorithms. They're going to be able to take over. These are universal approximators. And then so they came up with artificial intelligence. It's just computer models. It's always been just computer models. And there's good things about computer models and there's bad things about computer models. And we've had to live with this for a long time. The thing we have to guard against are bureaucrats and rulers who have convinced themselves that these computer models are themselves more than they are. Well, the thing told me to do this. And you see these nitwits out there, and this is sad. This thing told me to go out and do this harm to somebody. It's just a dumb computer model. Why would you give it any credence or heed it at all? And they do so because of these ridiculously misleading labels that computer science give them, and for people not thinking these things through. And you try to calm people down about these things. You say, look, here's the explanation why. I'm telling you why it's never going to happen. It's not that big a deal. Oh, you don't understand. Oh my God, they're going to get power from space. And you're never going to be able to shut them off. And they're insinuating themselves somehow. They don't know how. Right now, the AI is putting itself into your own computer. They just build these fantasies for themselves. And when you try to get rid of that fantasy, we saw this in the COVID panic too. When you try to get rid of this fantasy, if you don't go out without your mask, you're going to die and you're going to infect everybody and they're going to die. They become quite angry. You would think it would be great news. Here you've just told me your fear is that computers are going to take over the world and we're going to become their slaves. Nobody will have jobs anymore because they're going to take all the jobs. Nobody will have money. We'll all starve to death. And so computers are just going to rule what? They can't think that through. But you tell them, okay, look, here's why it's not going to happen. Don't you think you would be greeted as some kind of a prophet? Oh, that's wonderful. I was so worried that the computers were going to take over and you proved to me that they're not. Now I could relax. No, they become angry. They love that fear. Same thing with the COVID panic. The vaccination scare, where people lost jobs because they didn't want to get vaccinated. If you were with somebody and they were themselves vaccinated, everything would be fine until they found out that you weren't vaccinated. And all of a sudden they were terrified, which makes no sense whatsoever. If they think the vaccine worked for them, then the vaccine worked for them. It doesn't matter if somebody else is infected. But they could not reason that through. Fear takes over and fear kills, panic kills. And humanity just doesn't learn that lesson. That's just one thing we're stuck with.
So it sounds like on the one end, on the one side, you have the John Searle's Chinese room experiment in your
Yep,
mind,
that's it.
maybe, where we can say, well, yeah, we might not know the outcome because obviously there is, some kind of black box. The result might be interesting. We might not
Yeah.
even be able to predict it, but it nevertheless is ultimately something that does not reason. It does not have the power to think. It doesn't have an intellect. On the other end, you have guys like Nick Bostrom, who've written Superintelligence. He'll say, well, look, with enough power, with enough resources, with enough energy, with enough nuclear power plants maybe hooked up to these neural nets, what you'll have ultimately when computers talk to one another is enough information, enough to generate an intellect to actually produce answers above and beyond what a human can do. And it sounds like part of it, I think it would be trivially true to say, yeah, of course computers can do things that we can't do. They can do it quicker than we can. Like, you take out a calculator and in a few minutes you can see that that's self-evident. But certain things, it seems like, are out of the grasp of computers now. But Nick Bostrom will say, well, yeah, but that's only true for now. Maybe down the road, if only 5 or 10 or 20 years from now, we were to see what computers can really do. How would you
It's
respond to this idea?
it's a bluff. He's bluffing. They point to this idea called emergence. This is their magic word to say, I don't know how I don't know what consciousness is in humans. I can't tell you. I don't know what the intellect is. I've heard some people say that it's immaterial and that it's not made of matter. So is the will, but I don't know how that works. I don't know how the human brain works. I don't know how any of this stuff works. I don't know what mind is, but I'm telling you, computers are going to get there. All I got to do is give it enough electricity and it'll emerge. This is a bluff. It's just one grand bluff. They have no idea what they're talking about. Uh, that's just the way it is. I'm not saying that you can't make computers faster and better at the tasks to which they're given. That's obviously true. You could you could task a computer by giving it rules. Find everything deducible from this set of premises. All right, that's easy. And there are some deductions in that string which will not have been thought of by a person. Fine. Absolutely fine. That's just a calculating machine. That's all it is. But what you'll never have the computer do is be able to find it to come up with new premises, which themselves cannot be empirically proven and which are themselves true. That requires intellection, and that's what computers cannot do. They cannot emulate that. Computers are never going to get that smart because they don't have that capability. They can emulate, and they'll get increasingly good at simulating, I should say, the appearance of these kinds of things because you could just do that, right? You could just use people's images and so forth and make it look like it's real, but it's not going to be real. It's not going to do things. It'll just be yet another aid like a calculator was, and these computers are now. In fact, that's all it is right now. It is nothing more than that, and it never will be nothing more than that. So stop terrorizing yourself with these thoughts. That's all I can say about that, I guess.
Yeah. So there's really this unbridgeable chasm between the tasks and this artificial general intelligence that is right around the corner.
Exactly.
Hmm.
It's not just difference in speed or bulk. It's a difference in kind. It is an entirely different kind of thing. It's an entirely different essence. They cannot bridge that. They're just tools. Tools don't think for themselves. We need to think for the tools. It is we who look at the output of these computers and give it meaning. The computer does not give it meaning. There's nothing in there to give it meaning. There's nothing in there that can grasp meaning. Yet we can. And until you can explain how humans can do that, you're never going to have it work in a machine. And nobody knows how it works in humans. Not at all, really. I mean,
Hmm.
nobody. If intellect, like I believe, is immaterial, not made of matter, and our wills are not made of matter, then how does that work? How does that work? How does it really function? And what's the full explanation? We may be closed off from that for all eternity, just like we are, as it seems to be true. It follows from the same principles in certain quantum mechanical kind of a things, where locality seems, that is to say, nobody knows what causes these things, the full cause of these things. Nobody knows the full explanation for these things. The mind of God seems to be involved in all of these things. And we may not be, because we certainly can't do experiments on the mind of God, we may be forever closed off into knowing these things. And so if we don't know how to do it, we can't build a machine that could do it.
I mean, to go full circle, this idea of uncertainty is introduced when we do not know the full explanation for something, but that doesn't mean that the full explanation doesn't ultimately exist.
That's
It's-
absolutely right. That's it's fundamental. Everybody always goes right to the hard case. Well, I don't know, quantum mechanics, this, that, blah, blah. Okay. Well, a lot of people don't know how their car works. They go in there, they press the button, the car turns on, and they go. That doesn't mean the car doesn't work. Obviously, it does. And obviously, somebody knows how that works. Somebody knows how the quantum mechanics is working too. That's just not us. It's
Mhm.
something higher than us.
And this we call God.
And this we call God.
Well, William, is there any place that that you'd like to point our listeners and viewers to?
Yeah, I guess the easiest is WM Briggs, Substack.com, wmbriggs.substack.com.
And also your forthcoming second edition of Everything You Believe Is Wrong.
Yeah, I hope that's done by early summer.
Wonderful.
We'll
Well,
see.
that'll definitely be an exciting read. I know the first edition was.
My enemies put a lot of typos in it. That's why I don't want anybody to buy it. The typos will be all fixed, I hope, in the second edition.
Yeah. Well, it was nevertheless a real pleasure to read. So I look forward to the second edition.
Thank you.
William, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for being on Faith Deposited.
Thank you for having me.